The number one thing isn't necessarily to get them to listen to your podcast immediately. It's to get them to come back tomorrow. Because if they come back tomorrow for 5 weeks, they might end up coming back to the podcast or going to the podcast. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed the latest episode. It was episode number 72, Understanding the Deeper Layers to Podcast Success. Be nice if I could speak. Today, for episode number 73, Why You Feel Stuck with Your Podcast Growth. I would say top 2 questions I get when I'm talking to podcasters. 1, how do I get more listens? 2, how do I make money with my podcast? Today, we're going to focus on question number 1. And there's a reason. The landscape of podcasting, the landscape of social media, it has changed a lot since we started in 2017. Maybe it's changed a lot since you started in 2000, whenever it was, 17, 18, 19, 20, 2021, 2022. Things are changing so quickly with social media and algorithms, and there's just so many things going on. Why you feel stuck with your podcast growth. I want you to imagine, and I'm going to use this analogy. I'm going to use this as an example because I've been using this with clients a lot lately, and it's really been helping this point land. I want you to imagine that someone close to you just started a bakery, and you go to the bakery and you try the food and you think, wow, this is really good. The iced latte is good. The coffee is good. The tea is good. The croissants are good. Muffins are good. Donuts are good. Breakfast sandwiches, bagels. This is something. This is really good. And you finish your meal and your friend says, what'd you think? And you say, I loved it. It was great. Great meal. And they said, yeah, I know we have really good food, but nobody is coming. I don't know why nobody is showing up. And you think to yourself, okay, well, you have really good food, so that's good. The product's really good. And then you ask this person, what else are you doing? What are you doing on the day-to-day to help grow the business? And they say nothing. We have this bakery, and maybe we'll throw a sign out front from time to time, maybe throw a post up once a week or something like that. But other than that, we have really good food, so we think people should just come. If I asked you, what would you suggest for that business? You would probably have a list of ideas. You'd probably say social media, try to get on the news, giveaways, get active in the community, go on other podcasts, like go on podcasts and talk about it, local podcasts, right? Get on, sponsor stuff, give stuff away to other small businesses, give stuff away to the schools, whatever it may be. Just make yourself known, really, at the end of the day. And then I ask my clients, okay, why do we expect anything different with a podcast? If anything, I really do. I wonder if growing a podcast might not be harder than just growing a business. Now, I'm someone who has grown a business and it's been extremely, extremely challenging, but our business is connected to the podcast. Imagine if you had a storefront where people actually walked by. That would be super helpful. Podcasts aren't like that. Podcasts it's really hard to get discovered. It's not like YouTube where when you watch when somebody watches one of your episodes, they recommend a bunch of other episodes from you. It doesn't really work that way. The algorithm isn't set up that way. So why most people feel stuck with their podcast growth, they think having a podcast, even having a great podcast, is enough when it just isn't anymore. There's a lot of great podcasts out there. This is a really good connection to this. There's a couple rappers that I follow. One of them, I think his name is Nick D. N-I-C-D. Nick D. And he's a very successful rapper now. But you know what else he's very successful at? Social media. He is very creative with the way he promotes his music. Having good music isn't enough. There are so many people out there that have really good music, but nobody knows who they are. Because having good music, having good food, having good croissants, having a good podcast just isn't enough. So if you feel stuck with your podcast growth, maybe it's because you're putting all of your time, energy, effort, and focus into becoming a better podcaster, which I always support, but you can't take your foot off the gas when it comes to social media. You can't take your foot off the gas when it comes to other media, getting on other shows, word of mouth, SEO, blogs. It's really hard to do all of these things because at the beginning, you're just focused on, let me get an episode out. Let me get an episode a week. Let me get an episode a week. Let me get an episode a week. Okay, cool. And then eventually maybe you get to the place where you say, let me do an episode a week and let me start posting on social. But eventually you have to do a 10 out of 10 level effort doing an episode a week, a 10 out of 10 level effort on social media, 10 out of 10 getting on other podcasts. Everything has to be, unfortunately, a potentially overwhelming amount of effort. So I said this to someone the other day. I said, we have a Facebook group that we post in every day. Amy, shout out to Amy. We have someone on our team who posts in it every day, Amy. I went on, again, I don't say this with ego. I really, really, really don't. I say it because I want to show you how little it actually can matter. I went on 500 shows last year. I don't know the number. I lose track of the number because we go over it when we meet and then I forget the number. Hundreds and hundreds of podcasts last year. I would say I went on I averaged at least one a day for the entire year outside of our 365. It doesn't equate as much as it used to a translation and listens because it's way easier to get on podcasts now. Social media is something that we kind of just repurposed content for a while because we were so overwhelmed with everything else. But I can tell you, we didn't grow as fast as we would have if we were actually taking time to treat social media like social media. Social media is meant for you to create content. It's meant for you to cater content specifically to social media with the hope that you can grow your social media presence and then people will trickle into the podcast. Now, there's a lot of opposing views on that where people say posting on Facebook, posting on Instagram, posting on TikTok is a waste of time for podcast growth. Maybe for some people it is. I don't know. But I've worked with people who have a really large social media following who it's easy to grow their podcast. We launched a show for someone. She has 150,000 followers on Instagram. She was number 4 on the charts her first day. She'll win forever if she just keeps doing the podcast. I've had other people who have good followings on TikTok, maybe 90,000 people, and they get a good conversion to social media and their coaching is booked up. So social media works really well if you can grow your social media enough to make it meaningful. Now, here's what I'm not saying to go all in on social media and forget about the podcast, but let's use a gym analogy. When I was growing up, when I was younger, there was always the running joke of the person who skipped leg day, right? In my friend group, there'd always be someone who would make fun of someone for skipping leg day. They have a big upper body, they have big arms, but they get these tiny little toothpick legs. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but if you want to be a well-rounded bodybuilder, like I was trying to be in my past life when I was competing as a bodybuilder, you have to do upper body and you got to do chest and shoulders and arms and back, and you got to do legs and calves and abs. You have to work on everything equally to bring everything up at the same time. I think this is the same exact concept where you could be the best podcaster in the world, but if you don't do other things to feed the podcast, it's just like having really good food, but nobody knows about it. Nobody knows about the restaurant. And I think this is one of the reasons so many businesses die. There's a lot of people who are capable of adding a lot of value out there. There's a lot of people who have really good podcasts. I've been on a lot of them. I've been on some really good shows. But what they're not good at is marketing. What they're not good at is setting aside an hour a day to go through their DMs or go through their social media and build relationships with people. They're not there with that. They think having a podcast should grow the podcast. And if you feel that way, I'm not making you wrong for that, but that's probably why you feel stuck. I would argue that's probably what it is, because I've seen a lot of podcasters who they start a podcast and they expect, well, I'll throw up a post every once in a while. People will find my show. If I say to someone, what do you want as a goal? And they say, I want more listens. And I say, okay, what are people doing / supposed to do before the show? Where do they come from? And then where do they go after the show? A lot of people say, I don't know, word of mouth, maybe they'll search it. Or, I post on social media every once in a while. That's not good enough, most likely. And then where do they go? I don't know. They don't go anywhere. That's also not good enough. So let's go back to one of the OG episodes in the very beginning. I'm very passionate and fired up today just because I've been having this conversation on repeat recently, and I'm realizing this is why it's so hard to grow a podcast. Because you got to do so many things. You have to wear so many hats.
Hi there. This is Dr. Tarryn McCarthy, and I am the host of the Business of Happiness podcast, which would not be in existence were it not for the one and only incredible Kevin Palmieri. Seriously, I am so indebted to Kevin for the service that he provides. Every week he meets with me. He has been coaching me on how to initiate and launch this podcast. He helped me put it together with his great expertise, and every week his whole team works tirelessly to get these podcasts uploaded to Buzzsprout and to deliver my content to my audience. I am so grateful. I couldn't say enough about him. In fact, we've been working together so well. I've seen so much wonderful input from my listeners and asking me for more that in just a few weeks, we're going to be doubling the number of podcasts we produce per week. So this trajectory is just flying, and I'm really enjoying the whole process. So I couldn't say enough about him. Please, if this is something you're considering, I highly recommend him. And reach out to me anytime if you have any questions about our experience. Good luck. Bye-bye.
So let's go back to the original business model we talked about in the very beginning. Social media is the top of your business, then your podcast, then some sort of group, then some sort of freebie, and then some sort of paid opportunity. You don't have to set it up that way, but for the sake of clarity on this episode, let's just say you do. Okay. On a scale of 0 to 10, with the amount of time, energy, effort, and focus, how much are you putting into social media? If you say 4, I'm willing to bet you're probably not going to get much higher than 4 level results with your podcast. Now, is it always that way? No. There are anomalies, and there are people who have no social media followings but have big podcasts. I understand. I understand. But again, those are the anomalies. Those are more the exception to the rule than the rule. So on a scale of 0 to 10, how much time, energy, effort, and focus are you putting into social media? Creating content, creating captivating content, creating stuff that's going to help you stand out, stick out, build a brand, have people recognize your personality. On a scale of 0 to 10. On a scale of 0 to 10, how much time, energy, effort, focus are you putting into the podcast itself? The delivery of it, the quality of it, the stories, the guests, the titles, the equipment, the backdrop, the camera, all that stuff. Okay? Then we go below the podcast. So where are people supposed to go after? Let's just say it's a group. Facebook, Discord, WhatsApp, wherever. I know there's a lot of groups now. On a scale of 0 to 10, how much time, energy, effort, and focus are you putting in? Another common thing I hear is, well, the group's kind of dead. And it's like, okay, what are you doing to revive it? Because the group's always going to be dead if there isn't someone there to keep it alive. And that person, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, is you. How much are we putting into that? A freebie. The freebie, really, the thought behind the freebie is, 1, it's a value add. 2, it's a way to capture emails if you do it right. And 3, it helps your audience build trust in the things that you're creating. So if you have something for free, they might take a shot and say, let me download this PDF. Oh, wow, it's way more valuable than I thought. Do you have one of those yet? Even if you don't have anything to offer them from a paid position, it's still good to have a freebie. And then the paid part of it, whatever that is, courses, webinars, coaching, group coaching, live events, whatever it is, how much time, energy, effort, and focus are you putting into that? Because you can see, if you put level 10 time, energy, you put level 10 effort into the podcast, but you're putting level 4 effort into everything else, the podcast probably isn't going to grow that much, unfortunately. If you're putting in level 10 effort on social media and you're really getting results, but you put in level 2 effort into the podcast, it will get numbers, but it won't have recurrence. People won't keep coming back because the product's not good. You can see how you kind of have to have it all. Last story before we get out of here. Alan and I always talk about this. When we were kids, there was this ad on TV for this thing called the Banjo Minnow. And the Banjo Minnow, I may have talked about it on here before, I don't know. But the Banjo Minnow was this lure that you would use when you go fishing. And the commercial for this thing was so damn good. You could not watch this commercial and not buy the Banjo Minnow. The problem is, when you got it and you brought it home, it didn't work. It didn't work for me, and it didn't work for Alan, at least. They were really good at the social media. This was before social media, but they were really good at that. If this was a social media ad, it would have crushed. But they weren't necessarily as good at the delivery. I'm sure, maybe not, you've heard of Salt Bae, that guy on social media who sprinkles the salt over his arm weird. Very big social media following. Massive social media following. Go look at what the reviews for his restaurants are. Most of them aren't good and they're getting shut down. He's really good at one of the things, but the other stuff isn't really working in alignment. It's not the same. I think that's a really good way to look at it. How many hole-in-the-wall restaurants do we know that kind of look like garbage, but their food's really good? And somehow, maybe a friend introduces us to it, and you think to yourself, I never would have found this. Maybe that's your podcast. Maybe your podcast is a really quality piece of work that nobody is finding because it's not out there enough. So that really is that's my challenge for this episode. Last week, and again, I also understand, and I always want to put this out there because I do think it's important and I don't ever want to lose sight of it. I'm very privileged to be able to do this for a living. So when I say this, I understand circumstantially it will be harder for others than it might be for me. And I think that's just important to state. But last week, I went for a walk and I recorded 19 pieces of content. So I just went for a walk on this nice path, probably 10 minutes from where I live. I pulled out my cell phone and I recorded a bunch of 1-minute videos. That's something I haven't done in a long time because, truthfully, the rest of the business has taken a lot of my time. But you can't forget about the things that are most important to grow the podcast. The business is great and the business is growing, but the business is only going to grow to the level that the podcast does. So I got to make sure the podcast is growing. Even this Podcast Growth U, I am doing almost no promotion. Almost none. I started a TikTok. I got to start posting on there, but we've gotten a bunch of social media clients, so I've been spread thin. I haven't done that much, so I don't have that high of expectations for the growth. Now, the show is growing quite surprisingly and very positively, all things considered. I'm grateful for that. Grateful for each and every one of you. But I'm not doing as much as I should be because we're working so hard on the other podcast to make sure that keeps running and the business and the team that I need to do more custom podcast content too, for sure. I think we're in a different time now with social media where you can repurpose podcast content. I think that's really good for awareness. But the number one goal of social media is to get people to come back again, whether that's follow or maybe they engage with your content. That way you get your content showed more on their feed. But that's the number one thing. The number one thing isn't necessarily to get them to listen to your podcast immediately. It's to get them to come back tomorrow. Because if they come back tomorrow for 5 weeks, they might end up coming back to the podcast or going to the podcast. But you can imagine if you're just taking all of your repurposed content and your social media page is pretty much just a podcast page, that might be hard to grow the social media page. If it's all podcast stuff and somebody doesn't resonate with the podcast, they're not going to follow. But if it's, let's just say your podcast is about sports and you do 30-second clips that you do live or natively, you sit down and say, all right, what's going on right now in the NFL? Oh, this is a big story. Let me hammer a 30-second video and throw it up on social media. That's a standalone piece of content that does not have to connect to the podcast, but it helps your social media represent kind of what the podcast is about, but specific for social media. That's really my thought with this episode. If you think of a sitcom on TV that's 30 minutes, that's drastically different than a 3-hour movie. Social media and the podcast are different. A sitcom has to have a different story, different characters. The commercials are at different parts. Everything is catered for the fact that it's going to be on cable and it's 30 minutes. Where a 3-hour movie, there's a lot of time for the characters to play out. There's no ads. There's no commercials. So you can do things a little bit differently. I think it's kind of what's happening for a lot of us with social media and the podcast. So my one big takeaway here is you have to treat every layer of the business model like it's the only layer of the business model in terms of your effort, but it also has to connect smoothly to the rest. And if you feel stuck, I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, scale of 0 to 10 technically, how much time and energy and effort and focus are you putting into each layer? And where is the current bottleneck? A bottleneck meaning where is the blockage? Where is the kink in the hose? Oh, I do an episode a week. Feel like I've had some pretty good guests. I think the podcast is high quality, but I don't do social media at all. Okay. That's one of the reasons it's not going to grow. So I hope that makes sense. And I know it sounds maybe overly simplistic, but that's what I've seen at this point from coaching so many people. Having a podcast isn't enough. I mean, having a podcast is a requirement if you want to grow a podcast, but it is not the thing that's necessarily going to do it. Unless you're a celebrity or something like that, it's different. But I'm assuming 99.9% of us aren't. And we're going to have to do the hard yards, and we're going to have to do everything for a long period of time. So hopefully that makes sense. As always, if you want to book a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session, maybe you have questions about something we talked about today. Maybe you're struggling to get guests, struggling to get on other shows, struggling to figure out who your demographic is, whatever it may be, I would love to chat. I literally start every single one of these by saying, based on where you are today and where you want to get to eventually, what do you believe the most valuable use of our time together today is? So I will quite literally let you lead the conversation in terms of what you think would be the most beneficial. So link will be in the show notes as always. Next week for episode number 74, one scary truth that will actually help you. It's a sad truth. It's a scary truth. It's a frustrating truth. But I do believe at the end of the day, it will help you. So make sure you tune in for that episode. And also to those who celebrate it, happy Thanksgiving. I'm not sure. I'm not cultured enough to know what other holidays are right around this time. But in the US, Thanksgiving is next. Yeah, so Thanksgiving was yesterday. No, hold on. Yes, I will not talk to you again before Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving. This episode dropping Friday. Next Thursday is Thanksgiving. So the Friday after that will be another episode. Yes. Okay. As always, you are all the best. I appreciate you all very much. I hope the technology is working. I hope the lights are not blinding you. I hope you are not saying every word. I hope you don't lose your train of thought in the middle of an interview. And I hope you are courageous enough when you have a guest to do a live introduction and not record it after. That way you have the opportunity to make a mistake. Until next week, keep on podcasting, keep on crushing it, and we will talk to you then.